All right, so a couple things get out of the way before we get going. Um, so I've got that fourth Canvas discussion up. That's due by the end of the day on Tuesday. So I can't stress enough. Make sure you're getting on and getting this done early. If you're having issues at 11:50 p.m. the night before it's due, you know, those are avoidable, right? Um, so please try to get on and get that done. What was due before class today was that Module 10 reading and Module 10 quiz, and I expected you to watch that Module 10 video that was posted to YouTube. Excuse me. We'll walk through some questions similar to that daily quiz here today, and then what's not due today, but what's due before the beginning of class tomorrow is that Module 11 top hat. So we'll kind of start Module 11 here today, but the more complicated stuff we'll do tomorrow. So, make sure you're getting on, kind of taking that seriously so we can make class more effective tomorrow. And then the quiz 5 practice problems, I'll kind of have those posted. I'll post the fifth quiz after class tomorrow, which will be due by the end of the day on Monday. Okay, so you've got kind of, if you're studying for it, using those practice problems, you could take it tomorrow. I'll post it, right after class. You could take it over the weekend, or you could take it at any point on Monday. Okay. And then we've got 2 modules next week. So I've already started to kind of put up module 12 there. You can't see it yet, but it's there. Other than that, I think that should kind of take care of um, things on my end. Are there any questions before we kind of dive into the material here today? And then that third Canvas discussion should be getting graded here. It should be posted at some point tomorrow. And then we will have one more discussion, Canvas discussion, which I will post on next Monday, which will be due before um, the exam that Thursday. Okay. But we'll kind of talk about maybe some nice, easy kind of things about that. But that'll be next week. So we're going to start out, and we had to finish up a little bit of Module 9. So I want to revisit some ideas from Module 9. And even though we talked about them, or I think I might have worked through even an example yesterday, I want to kind of revisit it. So I know we worked through an example where we started looking at secondary effects, right? So when we change taxes, right, or we change government spending, we said that could have secondary effects, which is that it increases exports, or if it's through taxes, we said increasing income taxes or increasing corporate taxes could change one of these factors of pull and shift long-run aggregate supply. So let's think about if we had contractionary policy. So remember, contractionary fiscal policy means we're wanting to decrease real GDP. Okay. Oh, it'd be helpful if I had this turned on. So, oh, and it keeps messing up my settings here every time I log back into Canvas, and I don't know why, because it wasn't doing that for the past however many weeks. So I want this. There we go. So if we're thinking about contractionary fiscal policy, and we've got price levels, kind of real GDP, and let's say, so I'm going to work through kind of somewhat of a unique example. So let's assume for a second that we start out and we're actually at a point where there's no gap existing, right? So that original long run GDP and our original short run GDP are exactly the same. If we see contractionary fiscal policy, so what would that be? Well, contractionary, we are decreasing short run GDP. We do so by decreasing aggregate demand. How do we decrease that aggregate demand? We either decrease government spending, or we said we increase taxes. So if this is the case, right, we would see kind of this decrease in aggregate demand. Our new kind of short run GDP would be right here. So we've decreased aggregate demand. What now exists? Well, we might think, right, if GDP is now too low, we would have a recessionary gap. Okay. Now I didn't leave myself a lot of room here, so I might kind of draw this out again real quick. But what if that change in aggregate demand is actually lower than the kind of response or the change in my long run aggregate supply? So if that aggregate demand decrease, right? So it's causing my short run GDP to go down. The long run aggregate supply decrease is causing my long run GDP to go down, but by a larger amount. So I could think about just drawing this very extreme. If this was a larger kind of shift in my long run aggregate supply curve, which it was a decreasing, this was the idea that if I increase taxes, right? What impact is that going to have? Well, fewer people are going to want to work, so labor supply goes down. If this was corporate taxes, they have less money to make investments into physical capital, improve productivity through technology. So when I increase taxes, it has this corresponding effect on long run aggregate supply. Whereas kind of my new long run equilibrium, it's going to be down here. So now what do we end up with? That GDP in the long run is now going to be less than that GDP in the short run after that change in taxes. What do we now have? Well, if GDP is too high, we've got an inflationary gap. So if we start out with no gap, contractionary fiscal policy, we might think we're creating this recessionary gap. But because of the secondary effects that then has on long run aggregate supply, what we've actually created is an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, what's more likely to be the case is what if instead, kind of do this in a different color. What if instead that change in aggregate demand is actually greater than that change in long run aggregate supply? So notice initially we've caused this recessionary gap. If, and I'll draw this really extreme, let's say the change in aggregate supply is really, really small, right? So this is kind of like my third scenario. Okay. Well, what exists? I didn't leave myself a lot of room here, but this would be kind of my third scenario for long run GDP. Well, now notice that GDP in the long run, if that change is smaller, right, than the change in aggregate demand, now my GDP in the short run is too low. So what have I created here? Well, there was an original recessionary gap, but that response by long run aggregate supply, I still have a recessionary gap, but it's smaller than without that secondary response from long run aggregate supply. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Now, to be clear, I was kind of going through a thought experiment. If we started out with no gap, there's really no reason to use that contractionary fiscal policy. But I think it's easier to then think about kind of these changes that would exist. In reality, it would be likely that we start out with an inflationary gap. We then want to reduce GDP, and then we would have kind of a similar thing in terms of the response to long aggregate supply, whether or not uh, we reduce the recessionary gap, we kind of change the recessionary gap to inflationary, etc. Any other questions here before we keep moving? Okay. So I want to set this up before we go back to the slides. So we're going to discuss when we increase taxes, right, which we were just kind of thinking about. So whatever the overall level of taxes are, we can think about our tax revenue is equal to the value of that tax times, well, if it was a sales tax, it would be kind of the quantity of the goods being purchased, right? Or sorry, not the quantity. If this was a per unit tax, it would be the quantity of the goods being purchased. If it was a sales tax, it would kind of be getting multiplied by the amount of money kind of spent, right? And then times the sales tax. If it was an income tax, it's whatever the tax is times kind of whatever the current level of income is. So when you think about here, the tax is just getting multiplied by whatever we're taxing. So we want to think about this relationship between the overall level of taxes that we are creating, right, or putting into law, and what the corresponding tax revenue is going to be. So if we think about initially, right, when we increase taxes, we just said what's going to happen. Well, if we increase taxes, when I work, and I can think about if this was an income tax, I have less money I'm actually bringing home. I'm going to be less likely to want to work as much. So we see a decrease in the number of hours worked, or some individuals, this new level of income that they take home, they might not find it as worthwhile to work and they drop out of the labor force altogether. Okay. So as I increase taxes, I'm decreasing the amount of available income out there. People are dropping out of the labor supply. So initially, as I'm increasing taxes, there's going to be kind of these competing effects, right? When tax rates are low, we're going to end up seeing that tax revenue actually increases. So I'm going to kind of draw some things out that I think will help kind of solidify this idea. But for right now, this is going to be very similar to when we were talking about GDP growth in an earlier module. When taxes start out and they're relatively low, we're going to see that as we increase taxes, we increase tax revenue. People aren't very responsive. If taxes start to get very high, well, then if I keep increasing taxes, I would actually see a decrease in tax revenue. Sorry, yes, decrease in tax revenue. People are going to be very responsive, right? So I actually need to decrease my tax revenue to increase, right? My overall, sorry, I need to decrease my taxes to actually increase tax revenue. Okay, so what is this going to look like? And I'll kind of write out something that I think will help solidify this idea. So let's say initially, I'm thinking about the same change and we'll use an income tax here. So let's say that my tax goes from 0 to 1,000. Well, what was the total tax revenue if taxes were 0? 0. As I start to increase taxes, let's think about someone making $100,000. If I then tax that income and take 1,000 away, well, they're still earning quite a bit of money. It's likely they're going to stay in that labor market. And so we're going to see a pretty large increase in tax revenue because if we think about tax revenue, initially we could increase taxes by a relatively large amount, right? Going from 0 to 1,000 is a very large percentage change in taxes. And as long as that is greater than the percentage change in the overall kind of income, or we could think about this as the quantity of labor that's being supplied. Well, we know as taxes go up, people were less likely to want to work. So we kind of had these competing effects. The increase in taxes started to increase tax revenue, but as people drop out of the labor force, that would kind of decrease it, right? We'd have less available kind of income or less spent on goods, even if we're thinking about like a sales tax or a per unit tax. So if the percentage change in taxes is greater than that percentage change in income from people dropping out of the labor force, we can think about it as we had the percentage change in taxes increasing tax revenue. People dropping out was a smaller effect. So what's the total effect on tax revenue? It's going to be relatively high. However, as we start to get to higher levels of taxes, well, if someone was making $100,000 and I now go from taxing them by 30,000 30,100, or sorry, 31,000, right? Well, that same $1,000 increase, it's going to be a relatively small percentage change now in taxes. However, the response by workers might be, well, the lower and lower the amount of take-home pay I have, the more and more people are going to want to try to drop out of the labor force. So it starts to become that, yes, that percentage change in taxes is still larger than that percentage change in, we could think about kind of income or labor supply. So we would still, and kind of here, this second scenario, I'll kind of use red here. So at these higher amounts, right, I still see that increasing tax revenue, right? It's still greater than that reduction in labor supply, but they start to get closer, right? So I start to get that changes in taxes will start to increase tax revenue, but by lower amounts, or that slope is decreasing. So this is very similar to what we talked about once again with GDP growth. There's some point or there's some tax, here just the hypothetical value I'll think about, is 50,000 where tax revenue is maximized. Okay. Now, if I then continue to increase taxes, well, we could think about the most extreme scenario. If I start to tax people who make $100,000, right? I tax them 90, tons of people are going to drop out of the labor force to the point where if I had $100,000 in taxes, nobody's going to work. My tax revenue is back down to zero. So as I increase taxes at higher levels of income, more and more people kind of start to drop out of that labor force. And at these higher levels, what's true, that percentage change in my taxes starts to become lower than that percentage change in the overall available amount of income to tax because there's fewer people working. So when we're thinking about kind of tax revenue here, and it's that tax times the amount of available income, well now, right, that increase in my tax is going to be relatively small compared to that huge reduction in the amount of available income to tax. So what's going to happen here? I start to see my tax revenue go down as I increase taxes at higher levels of tax rates. Okay. You can't quite see all of this, but our y-axis was tax revenue here. Okay. Any questions on anything there before we kind of jump back into the slides? Okay. So we kind of call this relationship the Laffer curve, right? And it's very similar, like I said, if we go back to kind of that GDP growth that we were talking about. And that's the Lorenz curve. So another issue we can see that arises with fiscal policy, and I won't spend too much time on this, but if we try to correct for these inflation or recessionary gaps through fiscal policy, we talked about the secondary effects, right? There might be changes to net exports or there might be changes to the long run aggregate supply, but there's also going to be some issues in that if I enact this policy, if I raise or lower tax rates, well, it might just, excuse me, if I want to raise or lower tax rates, maybe I don't realize that there's an inflation or a recessionary gap right away. So it takes the government some time to recognize these problems exist, and so they're not reacting automatically. So we might still have an inflation or recessionary gap exist because it takes the government time to recognize that it actually is occurring. We might also see action time lag. So even if they know it's occurring, it takes time to enact policies. It takes time to write tax policy into actual laws. You know, there's political challenges, right, in terms of getting different bills passed that would change government spending or would change taxes, right? They have to get approved, and there's some, we won't dive into this class, but right, the different political parties might have different viewpoints on what to kind of spend government funds on. And then the kind of third thing is, even if we change taxes, right, um, it might take consumers and businesses time to kind of update their spending habits. So, initially I might not realize that tax rates have went up significantly, but once I see that tax bill come due that following year, maybe I'm like, oh, I need to kind of slow my roll, kind of need to change my consumption decisions. Right? So all of these would kind of make fiscal policy a little bit harder to use. Right? Um, so that should wrap it up for us for Module 9. I then want to take a dive into Module 10 here for a second, just looking at this last slide. And the reason why is because we're going to use some things in Module 10 here today and tomorrow in Module 11. So let's say I have this set up and I've got required reserve ratio and an amount of initial reserves. So one thing I talked about in that video, and one thing that like Top Hat talks about, is there's two ways in which the Fed can essentially inject money into banks. Right? So if I had a required reserve ratio of 8%, and I'm thinking about, we'll go work through the first scenario. Let's say that there was a deposit of $100,000 into the bank. Well, initially, that additional deposit will give me $100,000 of additional funds in my total reserves. Now, the amount of required reserves I have to set aside is that 100,000 times whatever that required reserve ratio is. So the amount, sorry. So the amount of required funds I have to set aside is 8,000, which means how many funds do I have left over, or what are my excess reserves I can loan out? Well, whatever the original deposit was, minus this amount that I had to set aside, I now have an initial amount of funds I can loan out of 92,000. So I can think about what impacts is this going to have on my money supply, or what is the change in my money supply from that change in my deposits. Well, the way I would define this, I think to make it easier to think about, is it's going to make the change in the money supply is going to be the initial amount that we have to loan out to these banks times 1 over that required reserve ratio. But we said here when we're making the actual calculation, it's in decimal form. Okay. So if I go ahead and do this math, right, I plug in my values, I'd have that change in the money supply from this initial $100,000 deposit. Well, I only have 92,000 left over once I have to put those required, that required reserve amount to the side. And so if I get my kind of values entered in here, I get what? 1,150,000 is the resulting change in my money supply. So I worked through an example kind of similar to that was on that daily quiz in class yesterday. So I want to kind of highlight there's a different scenario that we could have, right? So instead of a new deposit into the bank, right, that then is subject to these the required reserve ratio, let's say that the Fed buys bonds or securities. So essentially, they're giving money to these banks. However, when it's the Fed buying or selling these securities, the initial amount that they buy them for is not subject to that required reserve ratio. The only thing that's subject to that I have to set aside would be whatever is kind of just an initial deposit, right, from someone else into the bank. If it's the Fed buying or selling securities, when they buy them, that money goes into the bank. That's the total amount of money they can now loan out. So when we think about here, if it's the Fed buying bonds, that change in the money supply, once again, it's the initial amount that the bank now has to loan out. But now the initial amount, so let's say it was worth these bonds they're buying are the same $100,000. Well, now the initial amount that I have to loan out, because it's not subject to that required reserve ratio initially, is $100,000. Now, once I loan that out, it comes back. People then deposit, right, that amount of money into $100,000 back into my bank. Now it is subject to that required reserve ratio. So here the initial amount is 100,000, but the total effect on the money supply is still that times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So I kind of do the math here. I think I get 1,250,000, which is larger than that 1,150,000 from just an initial deposit into the bank. And the reason why is because the initial amount of loans we had to loan out when it was a deposit, we had to set aside these required reserves. When it's the Fed buying a bond or security from us, the initial amount that we have to loan out, that $100,000 isn't initially subject to that required reserve, and so we can loan out the full 100,000. So that's going to be the difference when the Fed buys or sells securities or bonds. It's always going to have a larger impact on the money supply than if it's simply a deposit from someone else into the bank. Okay. And once we kind of build out the money supply market, I will connect this idea back to what we talked about here. I don't think we'll quite get there today. If we do have time, I might kind of work through this at the very end of class. Otherwise, we'll take a peek at it tomorrow. Okay. But for now, we want to think about buying or selling securities. Excuse me, is going to put more money into these banks. They can then loan that out. It's going to increase our money supply. So that should kind of wrap it up. And really for Module 10, this is kind of the stuff I want to focus on, right? These just last two slides making these calculations. The rest of this is really just the logistics of what money supply and what the Fed kind of looks like. Okay, some characteristics. So we're now going to jump into Module 11. So we're going to start to think about how can the Fed, instead of the government, impact or resolve inflation or deflationary gaps. So instead of fiscal policy, we're going to think about the Fed engages in monetary policy. So the tool that the Fed has is it can increase interest rates that banks have to pay on loaning out reserves. It can change it through open market operations from the buying or selling of bonds and securities, government-backed bonds or securities. It can increase or decrease that required reserve ratio on initial deposits. And then the discount rate, we'll talk about here in a second, that's going to be applied to the loaning out of funds, right? So they don't often use that, but it is technically a fourth one. So if I increase the interest rates on these reserves, so this isn't the amount I have to set aside. This is the amount that would have to be paid when someone wants to kind of take some of these reserves and they're sold, they're put out there as loans, right? So same kind of idea of things we've talked about before. If interest rates are higher, is borrowing more or less costly? Well, it's going to be more costly, so I'm going to discourage borrowing. Through discouraging borrowing, right, that's going to actually lower the amount of money supply. Sorry, there we go. Lowers the money supply, right? So at higher interest rates, we get less available money out there. That's going to lower our money supply. And these are interest rates on reserves, not like overall interest rates in the economy. Decreases in that interest rate are going to encourage borrowing. And I think here, I'm going to replace the slides. I think I initially, the ones I posted, I copy and pasted this and forgot to change everything because everything works in the exact opposite direction. If we have decreases in interest rates, borrowing is now cheaper. So it encourages borrowing, which means people are going to take out more and more loans, right? So they kind of end up changing the money supply because of that multiplier effect. And we get increases in the money supply. Now, if I'm thinking about buying and selling these government-backed securities, when we buy these securities, so some of these are examples are like treasury bills. If we buy them, we're putting money out there into the economy. So that's the best way I can say to think about. It's not maybe the most technical way, but when I buy something, I'm giving somebody money. So if I buy these securities or bonds from the banks, I'm giving them money, which they can then loan out if they have additional funds. We said that increases our money supply. If I instead sell to these banks, well, then the bank is giving me money. I'm taking money away from those banks that they could be loaning out, sorry. So I'm decreasing the money supply there. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. So that's another tool. The third one is we kind of talked about I can change the required reserve ratio, right? So this was the idea we said, just as a reminder, we kind of already just worked through this, but maybe it's helpful to see it again. That change in the money supply that came from kind of what was happening with that multiplier effect was whatever the initial amount of funds we had available to loan out, the total change in our money supply was that times this money multiplier, which was 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if I decrease this ratio, this multiplier or the fraction goes up and I see an increase in my money supply. So by changing the required reserve ratio, the Fed can essentially change the money supply. Okay. So that's a fourth tool that they have. If instead of decreasing that required reserve ratio, oh, also I want to make this other point. Sorry. Stop sharing. There we go. So not only would decreasing the required reserve ratio kind of have this impact on the money supply in this way, remember if I decrease the required reserve ratio, what amount of money do I have to set aside from an initial deposit? A lower amount, which would mean the initial amount that I have left over to loan would also increase. So it kind of has like two effects on the change in the money supply, but they both would increase or push money supply in the same direction. So I forgot to kind of mention that. It doesn't really matter, right? As long as we think about one of those effects, we'll get the correct directional change. But technically, it would impact both the amount of the initial reserves that we could loan out, but also that multiplier effect. And then the exact opposite is true. If we increase the reserve ratio, decreases our money multiplier, which then decreases our money supply. Or as we increase the required reserve ratio, there's fewer amounts of initial funds to loan out, which also would kind of have this impact of decreasing the money supply. Just looking at some kind of actual values here, if we look at required reserve ratios, China's they've in 2018 they actually decreased theirs. So if they were decreasing them, we said what impact would that have? It would increase their money supply. And we'll then think about later on today what impacts would that maybe have on their interest rates. The current reserve ratio of the United States is actually 0%, right? I think it was 2020 they changed it and they just haven't increased it since then, right? So there, if we think about like um, what is the total effect kind of that change in um, change in the money supply from like a initial deposit, uh, there it's going to get a little bit harder to think about because, dividing anything by zero is kind of undefined. We will see that there's going to be other things that would kind of change our money supply, so we wouldn't see kind of like an infinite amount. But it does get kind of difficult there to think about when you have that required reserve ratio of zero. But you can only increase it from there. So as I increase it, we would kind of have that same directional change, which is as we increase the required reserve ratio, it would decrease our money supply, which would then correspondingly, or sorry, decrease the amount that our money supply goes up by. All right. So the other tool that they have is changing the discount rate. So the discount rate is the amount that's being charged, not for kind of buying the reserves, but for the bank that is lending them out. So similar kind of idea. So it's rarely used, but it's the same as changing the interest rates on the reserves that are being kind of purchased or used. So, as I increase the discount rate, it makes borrowing more costly. As borrowing becomes more costly, fewer people are going to want to, take out loans. If there's fewer people taking these loans out, there's less available funds out there or a decrease in the money supply. And then the exact opposite, if I decrease discount rates, borrowing is cheaper, encourages them borrowing. There is now more money people are taking out to kind of purchase goods and services. We see an increase in money supply there. So these are the 4 tools that the Fed has to influence that money supply. So the next thing we'll talk about, kind of a little bit of a step aside, and this will introduce the idea, but we will eventually have a more complete model that you don't just have to take my word for it, that would actually kind of prove this theory that I'm about to show you. So there's this quantity theory of money, which says that whatever real GDP is times prices, so that would be my nominal GDP, so real GDP, we can think about, times the current price level, that amount of nominal GDP, the amount of money that's being spent on goods and services, is whatever the initial money I have in the economy is, times the number of times, right, that cash is being spent on final goods and service. So you almost think about this as whatever money is out there, however many times it's used, that would add up to the total expenditures, right? How do we calculate real GDP? Well, that would be the total amount of expenditure, right? If that's going to be equal to aggregate demand, that was sorry, let me say this again. I'm talking too quickly and I want to make sure I say this correct. When we were thinking about our long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, what was true? Real GDP or potential GDP is always the same in the long run. So price levels don't impact it, but they do impact nominal GDP. Now, the amount of money that's out there times the number of times that it's used, well, that would be like total expenditures, right? The total number of dollars that are spent in the economy over the given year. Well, what would that look like? That's our expenditure approach to calculating that aggregate demand curve. The point where aggregate demand hits our long run aggregate supply, this is going to be kind of like that long run equilibrium. So these two things should be equal, right, in the long run. Now we can also take that same equation and any change in one of these factors, right? If we're thinking about, instead of just this general equation, changes in all of them should also be equal, right? Any total change in expenditures should be matched with the total change in nominal GDP. Okay. So let's think about this growth rate equation. Well, first of all, if I look at the data, changes in money, right, that money that's out there, or the money supply, changes in money supply are often matched with increases in that inflation rate. Well, what is my inflation? It's change in prices. So anytime we see that change in the money supply go up, it's matched by, or this equation, this equality has to hold, it ends up being matched by changes in prices or inflation. So we'll kind of go through why this is the case here before we end class, or sorry, at the beginning of, at the very end of class today. But for now, just kind of take me at my word, I suppose. So, I could go through an example, and I won't waste a lot of time on this. This is honestly, should be, if I asked you this on a quiz or exam, very easy points. So if this equation, this quantity theory of money has to hold, if I've got money growth of 3%, I've got the number of times money is spent over the year, or that velocity of money is 5%, and GDP grows at a level or a rate of 8%. What must inflation be? Well, inflation is my change in prices. If I plug these values in, one equation, one unknown, 3 times 5 divided by 8, I think is like 1.75, 15 over 8. I think that's right. Um, and so, pretty basic calculation there. I want to save some time for what I think is maybe some more difficult stuff before we end class today. So we're now going to think about a model that we're going to use the amount of money supply out there to determine interest rates. Um, well, if we have any market, right, we need to think about not just the supply, but the demand. So where does demand for money come from, right? Well, it comes from a couple different places. So first of all, the Fed is going to influence the money supply, right, through changes in one of those four things that we talked about earlier. So they don't actually set interest rates. They set the money supply, which would then change the equilibrium interest rate, right? So the way in which it will change the interest rate depends on what the current money demand is, right? The Fed will use these tools to kind of set or change money supply, but the equilibrium of any market is where supply is equal to demand, so where the money supplied is equal to the money demanded. What would change our money demand, right? Well, if in order to buy kind of more goods and services, right? If there are um, if there's a higher level of overall national income, people have more money to spend, they need more US dollars in order to purchase more goods and services. So this would be kind of the idea that as income goes up, we expect to see the money demand increase. Now, there's also precautionary demand, which is that if I think I'm going to have future expenditures, right, and they might be unplanned, like I think that maybe there's some instability and that I might have to pay higher prices in the future, right, then I'm going to want to hold more money today so that I can pay for those future expenses. So when would this demand be lower, right? Well, if I expect economic times to go down, right, or I think there's going to be additional expenditures, maybe how is that? Well, maybe if my borrowing becomes more costly, so like higher interest rates, then we might see precautionary demand actually go up, right? If interest rates are higher, um, I'm going to be less likely to put money into, you know, taking out loans. I'm going to hold more of that money. I want it. We're going to see an increase in the money demanded. And then kind of a similar idea, if I'm thinking about asset demand, whoops, sorry, uh, I might want to purchase assets so that I can take money today and kind of store it for future use. Well, if I'm storing it for future use, that means that currently I want to hold less money, right? I'm putting it into assets as opposed to spending it. So there we would kind of see that when there's interest rates that are lower on these assets, so this is not the interest rate I'm going to have to pay for borrowing, but I'm buying assets. It's the amount of the increase in my investment that's going to occur over time. Well, they're having lower rates means I'm going to be less likely to invest in these assets, means I'm going to hold on to more kind of money, which would increase my money demand. Okay? So these are three ways or three areas in which money demand is going to be kind of calculated. But for us, I won't focus on this as much as, if I can get, there we go, things that are going to change money demand, but then also what the money demand relationship is between, um, what the money demand relationship is with interest rates. So if interest rates are higher, then what we can think about is from some of our different components, we said that borrowing is more costly. So if borrowing is more costly, then we're going to see that, sorry, let me say this again. So if interest rates are high, right, then if we kind of wanted to take out these loans, right, the opportunity cost increases of holding money, right? So this is the idea that if interest rates are high, I could be investing this money, right? But I'm not. So as I hold on to more money, that's a kind of higher cost to me. So what do I want to do? I want to increase more assets or I want to invest this money. So the quantity of money that I currently am going to be demanding is lower. And then kind of the opposite is true, right? If instead I had lower interest rates, Well, there I wouldn't be making a lot of money by investing into assets, so I'm more likely to want to kind of hold on to it today, make more purchases today. So at lower interest rates, I actually see the quantity demanded of money would be higher. So just like any other demand curve, the changes in the y-axis variable or interest rates don't change the overall money demand curve. They just move us to different points or to different quantity demanded amounts of money. All right. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Um, what else do I want to say here? Okay. So I think we're good. So I want to hold on to this idea of the relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money. What then would shift our money demand curve? Well, if individuals have more available income, right, even at the same level of interest rates, right, they're now going to have more available funds, right, to make purchases. And so the amount of money that they want currently to buy goods and services, if they have higher levels of income, we're going to see increases in money demand, even if the interest rates are unchanged. So I can kind of think about this as at any given interest rate, when I have more available funds or higher GDP or higher income, if we want to think about this kind of through a consumer lens, excuse me, at that same interest rate, we now are going to want to hold on to or want to have more available money, or more available funds, or our demand for money is going to increase. All right. So at every single interest rate, at that same interest rate, we now, because of having more income, are going to see an increase in the quantity demanded, which would cause the entire money demand curve to shift. Another thing that we'll think about is going to shift this money demand curve are prices. Because even if I want to buy the same number of goods, when prices go up, how much money do I need? I need more. So when prices increase, I also am going to increase the money that I demand, right? So there, what do we get? An increase in prices or income, or an increase in prices or GDP would increase that money demand. Now, where does this also come from? Or what we kind of relate this to that we've already talked about today? Changes in GDP or changes in prices, if they increase, they must be matched by a change in the money supply. So that's all. Oops, I went too far. There we are. So that's all that this is telling us, right? That shifts in money demand because of changes in income or GDP or prices, that's going to increase or shift our money demand curve to the right. Okay. Now, we'll talk through, right, some things first before I draw this out for us. But let's think about what tools, right, the Fed has to set the money supply. So we have money demand. Any market, to find the equilibrium, we need to find where supply is equal to demand. So what are some, how can we set the money supply as the Fed to achieve our final goals? We want to increase employment, we want price stability, we want economic growth, and we want financial market stability. Okay. So we're instead going to think about monetary policy that would achieve these goals. So what is money supply? Well, it's dictated by, or how do we determine the money supply? We've already kind of thought about buying or selling of securities on that open market through open market operations. Required reserve ratios would change the impact of deposits or the buying and selling of bonds or securities, would cause the change in the money supply to go up or down depending on which way we change that required reserve ratio. And then the interest rates on reserves or the discount rate on lending those reserves, that's also going to increase or decrease our money supply. So these are the four tools that the Fed has. So our money demanded, we said, is going to change by, whatever is going to change when GDP or price levels go up or down. I put taxes in here. I am not going to complicate this. I throw it in here as a caveat. So none of the examples I give you, while we think about taxes influencing money demand, we're only going to think about them influencing that aggregate demand when we were looking at the real GDP price level connection. So when it comes to this money market, the money supply, money demand, we're thinking about the money market. We're not going to think about how it's impacted by changes in taxes, but we could because changes in income taxes would change our real GDP or our income levels. I just wanted to kind of mention that if we had a more complicated model, we would have changes in both, by changing taxes, we could actually change both fiscal policy and essentially have effects on the money market as well. But we will kind of gloss over that to not make it too complicated. Okay. So we've got this money supply that the Fed can manipulate. So we kind of talked about here was the things that it can do to increase money supply. Buy securities, put more money out there, decrease any of these rates. So the interest rates and the discount rate make it now less costly to borrow. More people borrow, get money to then put out there to buy goods and services. So we see money supply increase. And then we talked about that required reserve. The same initial deposit into a bank will increase the money supply by more when that required reserve ratio was lower. Okay. So with this idea in mind, what is our money market going to look like? So it's going to have this, once the Fed kind of uses its tools, there's going to be an overall level of money supply. So if we think about why, remember what was true about the supply curve for real GDP. Regardless of the price, real GDP was the same. And we said that price times real GDP had to be equal to the money supply times the velocity of money. So the money supply is also going to be vertical. So let's think about how would changes in money demand or money supply impact the interest rates. Okay. So interest rates are set by where money supplied is equal to money demanded. You can think about people wanting to supply money or giving out loans. People who demand money are wanting to take those loans out. And then that would set kind of the interest rate that we see on these loans. We could even think about this in terms of like mortgage rates. Okay? They're just a specific type of interest rate. So if I've got this market and I'm trying to understand this relationship between real interest rates and the overall quantity of money, well, we have this decreasing demand for money. And I think, in, notation wise, I'll write this sometimes as like money demanded, but it's the demand for money. You can kind of think about it, just notation there. Oh, sorry. I'm starting to write before I think about what I'm doing. So I just told you that what's true about the money supply curve. So we had real interest rates here. Here's my demand for money. We said the money supply was kind of this vertical or, right, supply of money, however we want to notate this. So the equilibrium quantity of money will be this point where the quantity demanded is equal to money demanded is equal to money supplied. That will set the initial interest rate. So if we have changes in money demand, so let's say I had an increase in income. What is that going to do? Well, it's going to increase my demand for money. Right? People have more available funds, or we thought about it through that quantity theory of money. As GDP or income levels go up, it would have to be matched with changes in the money supply or the demand for money. Okay. So what would that do to kind of our real interest rates? It would increase them. Okay. Now, what if instead I had something like a decrease in prices? Well, this was the idea that if I want to buy the same number of goods, so real GDP hasn't changed, but price levels go down, I don't need as much money before to get that same amount of goods and services. So there we would see that demand for money would actually go down, which would do what? Decrease my real interest rates. Okay. So that's going to be the impacts of money demand on this money market. Now, what if instead I think about what is the impact going to be in this market if the Fed starts to use its tools. So here we've got the demand for money. We've got our initial supply of money, our initial interest rates. If the Fed buys securities, right? Or we could think about it as if it decreases that required reserve ratio, well, they're putting more money into the economy. Banks get to hold on to loan out more money to the economy. This would cause us to see a supply of money increase, shift to the right. What does that do to our equilibrium interest rates? It lowers them. Okay. So shifts in the supply and demand for money will change those interest rates. And then if we had a decrease in money supply, what would that do? Increase interest rates. Okay. So why do we care? Right? Or what's the point of this money supply, money demand model? Well, remember, I kind of already alluded to this in the fiscal policy module. When interest rates change, right? And before we were thinking about the quantity of loans, but really that can be thought of like how much money is being given out, right? The demand and supply for money. It's just this is going to impact interest rates as well, right? We have multiple factors that can influence interest rates. Here, one of them is money supply and money demand, or the money, So here, if I think about, we could then take a look at the daily quiz for today. So we're going to come back to this, right? But we're going to use this idea of changes in money supply or money demand, right? Change equilibrium interest rates. So we're going to try to understand with the second question in the daily quiz today, what's this relationship between interest rates, kind of measured by mortgage rates here, the interest rate on mortgages, and essentially what that kind of level of, we could think about this as almost like the level of GDP in the economy. So we'll kind of start to think about this here. So we'll walk through this kind of monetary policy. I want to, we'll revisit this in tomorrow's class. I want to make sure that we get through this daily quiz here today. So July 23rd quiz. Kind of got 2 questions, and I should change this, have this for my earlier section. So just before I forget, we do in 2 days, right, at 3:30 p.m. And 2 days would kind of carry us over the weekend, right? 2 class periods. So I'm going to take a look at this quiz. And we're going to think about, okay, if I want to think about things that would change my equilibrium interest rates, which of the following would increase them? So I've got change in price levels, changes in income, changes in my required reserve ratio, and changes in the buying or selling of U.S. securities. So which one of these is going to increase my equilibrium interest rates? Well, it's really what we were just working through. So we'll walk through kind of each one of these. All right. So if I'm thinking about, I've got this quantity of money, and I've got my real interest rates that would be kind of determined here. I've got my initial supply of money. I've got my initial demand for money. Okay. So here's my equilibrium interest rate. If I saw decreases in price levels or decreases in income, so if we remember, we said we could think about this as my money supply times the velocity of money has to be equal to prices times my real GDP. So decreases in either of these will have to be matched by a decrease in the money supply. And so if I had decreases in price levels or income, what's actually going to happen to my interest rates? They're going to fall. Okay. So those can't be the right answer. So if instead I'm thinking about the same money market, Here's my, keep this consistent, my initial money demand. Here's my initial money supply. Here's my initial equilibrium interest rates. So the first kind of option we're given, or one of the first things that we'll work through is what if they bought U.S. securities? Okay. Well, if we purchase U.S. securities or bonds, right, we're putting money out there, or we are increasing the supply of money. It's, putting money out there is not the most technical way of saying it, but I think that's an easy way to think about, right? We're giving more money to the banks to loan out. We then said, okay, what's the total effect that they have on the money supply? It was that times one over the required reserve ratio. So if we see an increase in the amount of money the Fed is giving banks by buying bonds or securities, that's actually going to decrease the real interest rate as well. So hopefully the answer to this one is increases in required reserve ratio because that's the only one left. And we're looking for what increases real interest rates. Well, we said, what is the change in our money supply? It's going to be whatever that initial amount of money the banks have to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. Well, we said if that required reserve ratio goes up, right, that's going to decrease our multiplier. Now, it also means the initial amount that they have left over, right? If someone makes a deposit of $100,000, they have to set more of it aside. And so the initial amount of money they have to loan out is also going to be lower. So both of these things decrease our money supply, which would do what? Increase real interest rates. So that's the one that we're looking for there. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. So this next idea, haven't really discussed it, but I think it's worthwhile to see it worked through first. Um, and we will look through more examples and probably dive a little bit deeper into it in tomorrow's class. So if we had an inflationary gap existing, so we're kind of going back, we're going to connect this long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to our money market, right? So let's say I've got my initial long run aggregate supply, the corresponding aggregate demand, not corresponding, but the aggregate demand and the corresponding short run aggregate supply curve, right? So this would be if there's no gap that exists, right? We're told that there's an inflationary gap, okay? So what do we know would have to be the case? Well, it must be, if there's an inflationary gap, that the short run aggregate supply curve is actually hitting aggregate demand at a GDP level that is greater than our long run. And this is our inflationary gap. Okay. So what did we say we would typically do? Well, we typically would want to decrease aggregate demand to get to this long run GDP level, closing that inflationary gap. How can we do that? Well, we could decrease government spending or increase taxes. Okay. And we'll for right now ignore that we know maybe there's some secondary effects that exist, through net exports or through changes in those factors of pull, which shift our long run aggregate supply. But for now, we're just going to think about if we were trying to use fiscal policy, that's what we would want to do. Because we're not going to be focusing on fiscal, we're actually going to be focusing on monetary policy. So, how can we decrease aggregate demand? Through the money market. So if I think about my money market and I've got the quantity of money, I've got real interest rates, I've got my demand for money, and I've got my supply of money, and I've got my initial equilibrium interest rate. So this is where I think it's helpful to kind of work backwards. So we talked about one thing, which is the secondary or crowding out effect of changes in taxes. No, sorry, not changes in taxes. We talked about the crowding out effect in um sorry. We talked about the crowding out effect if we were increasing or decreasing government spending, the impacts that would have on interest rates, and then the impact that would have on investments, right? So here, if I want a decrease in my aggregate demand, if I'm thinking about how is that going to work through investments, if I want investments to go down, what do I actually want to do? I want to increase real interest rates. If I want to increase real interest rates, what would I have to do if I was the Fed? I would have to decrease that money supply. How can I do that? Well, when I'm asked specifically about US securities or bonds, how do we decrease the money supply? We need to take money away from these banks, so we need to actually sell those bonds or securities, right? So the Fed is going to sell those US securities. That, as a result, right, is going to decrease the money supply and increase real interest rates. As those interest rates go up, we said investments into physical capital are going to go down, right? These companies are taking out fewer loans to be able to invest into physical capital. That's going to then, right, aggregate demand was C plus I plus G plus net exports. So we're going to see this decrease, right, in our investment level or decrease in aggregate demand, which would then help us close inflationary gaps. So we could use fiscal policy or we could use what we call monetary policy. The Fed can use monetary policy by buying or selling bonds, right? Changing that required reserve ratio, or we said changing the interest rate or discount rates on reserves. So we're still trying to do the same thing. We're trying to adjust GDP so that we get no inflationary or deflationary gap. It's just that instead of government spending or taxes, we're doing it through the tools that the Fed has, right? And doing it through interest rates to then impact the level of investment that then shifts our aggregate demand curve. Okay. So fiscal policy, we're really focusing on kind of government spending and then how taxes would influence consumption. And then kind of monetary policy, we're really focusing on kind of that investment in physical capital by, I don't want to say manipulating, but changing that real interest rate. So I think I might have glossed over this earlier, but people often say that the Fed sets the interest rate. Well, not technically, right? They use the buying and selling of bonds or securities. They use that required reserve ratio to adjust the money supply, which then kind of sets a desired interest rate. But that's to some degree gets tricky because we then have to estimate, okay, what is this current demand for money? What's the slope? We use data to kind of estimate that, but it is a little bit harder, right? So we're not directly setting those interest rates. We're kind of adjusting them through the use of the money supply. So there we sell those securities in order to increase real interest rates, which then decreases investments, which would then decrease real GDP, but it's also going to increase prices. So actually, no, sorry, not increase, decrease prices, right? We're looking at contractionary monetary policy. So here, just to make sure you have time to get this submitted, should be sell. It's then going to increase real interest rates, decreasing investments, which will then decrease short-run prices. So I thought that the final question was about real GDP, so I stopped maybe a little bit earlier in what we were doing. So let's now think about why this is decreases in short-run prices. So make sure you're getting that submitted if you're here live. And I will then kind of look back at that graph to make the point. Well, initially, what was my equilibrium price? We were right here in the short run. After, right, we see this monetary policy. Now we're reducing GDP with this monetary policy. So kind of similar to fiscal policy, we'll call this contractionary, right? Monetary policy. What does that do to our new short run and long run prices? Well, it actually causes them to go down, or we've caused deflation, right? So that's why that third part of question two was that this monetary policy that we engaged in actually causes prices to go down. Any questions on that before we keep moving to kind of finish class here today? Okay. So tomorrow, what we will do is kind of continue to look at this either contraction or expansionary monetary policy. So we'll look through the example we didn't work through today. We're then going to kind of look at that monetary policy, how it might kind of look at more complicated models where we see uh, changes both in long run aggregate supply at the same time as kind of engaging in this monetary policy, thinking about the connection of that. Where do I have this here? To net exports. So kind of similar to fiscal policy, we could have secondary effects from that monetary policy. It's just fiscal policy has secondary effects through investments into physical capital or to the long run aggregate supply curve. We can think about some secondary effects that could exist from monetary policy might be through the changing of net exports. So we'll kind of talk through that tomorrow. We should have more than ample time, I think, to kind of finish up module 11. I won't start module 12. We'll just kind of end with that and work through more examples. In fact, if I have a little bit of time at the end of class tomorrow, maybe I'll pick and choose a few of those practice problems to kind of help study, kind of review for that quiz. But other than that, the only thing to kind of focus on due date wise is getting that module 11 reading done before we start class tomorrow, and then start to prepare for that module 5 quiz, which will be posted once we are done with class tomorrow. So I'm going to stop the recording here.